convention. And as you'll see, that led to a significant drop in the proportion of voters who were undecided and an increase in both support and opposition to the idea. We have 52% at the end of the survey, a slim majority that said they would be inclined to vote to call a convention, and 39% who were opposed. Now, of course, before voters could act on a measure to call a convention, they would need to be given the right as voters to take that action, which would likely require an intermediate step. And so we also asked the respondents how they felt about that idea, as you'll see on the following slide. Placing a measure on the state ballot that would give voters, rather than the legislature, the right to call a convention. When we asked voters if they would support or oppose that idea, by an even more striking margin, 60% to 30%, they told us that they would support it. So whether or not they think a constitutional convention is a good idea, they like the idea that voters should be empowered to make that choice rather than simply leaving that in the hands of the legislature. And on this idea of having the right to call a convention, I think it's worth highlighting some of the consistency, again, of the demographic breakdowns in support for the idea. If we look at it by gender, the idea of giving voters the right to call a convention is backed by 59% of men, 60% of women. No difference at all. By age, also very little difference. Ranging from those voters under 30 to voters 75 and over, we have solid majorities in each case that favor giving voters the right to call a convention. By political party, independents, a large and growing share of the California electorate. The proportion who are registered as declining to state a party affiliation has doubled over the course of the last 16 years, and that group is the most enthusiastic about giving voters the right to call a convention at 70%. But we still have both Democrats and Republicans that, by solid majorities, roughly 2 to 1, indicate that they back the idea as well. And then lastly, geographically. If we break the state into major regions, LA County, the counties surrounding LA, Bay Area, San Diego, Northern California, and then the Central Valley, in each place we have between 57% and 2/3 of voters that say they would like to give voters the power to call a constitutional convention. So overall, what we take away from the survey, and we can go ahead and put up all these conclusions. Obviously, there is high levels of voter dissatisfaction right now with the way that state government is operating. The idea of calling a convention is something that voters are intrigued by. They're more likely to support it out of the gate than oppose it, and they are strongly supportive of the idea of empowering voters to make the decision to call that convention. Ultimately, however, as with all such matters, the devil is in the details, and these levels of support are likely to evolve as more specifics are determined about how such a convention might be structured. But as a starting point, this clearly shows that voters are interested in the idea and that it merits further exploration. With that, be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Dave. We have time for questions. I will start with a couple on the texting and then go to the gentleman on my right here. And these are questions that are not necessarily related to the poll, but if you have thoughts on it or things that were asked as part of the poll. Did you ask anything about how people would be chosen for the delegation, or any thoughts on that?
I think those are probably issues that are better to defer to this afternoon's speakers, who can speak to the technical aspects of how delegate selection would work. But these kinds of details are obviously things that ultimately would be important to voters, and further research would need to take a look at them.
Okay, great. Please.
Hi, my name is Bruce Abbott. I'm a school board member from Marin County. I'm curious, in when you're out talking to the public, if there was a sense of if the convention was started with questions as opposed to recommendations. I have a concern when I read some of the things that we have a lot of ideas already. You know, let's do a 2/3, let's eliminate the 2/3. The people, are they more open to this if we go into a question which is let's reform, as opposed to let's take these ideas and see if we like them or not? Is there any sense of the acceptance based on those kind of questions?
I think it's highly dependent on which ideas are presented to them. I mean, we showed you an example of some specific reforms that voters are enthusiastic about, and I think if you went to them and said, we're going to have a convention and these are some of the kinds of reforms that we could potentially enact, they'd be enthusiastic. But we saw that voters were pretty divided between those who thought that a convention should look at the Constitution broadly and those who should look at it narrowly. And I think that suggests that sort of predetermining what the specific issues are that would be addressed might leave a significant number of those voters less certain about whether they would support it. So I think just based on the limited data we have so far, broader is probably a little bit better than narrower.
Okay, please, over here.
I'm Paul Hoffman, former director of the Oregon Research Institute. I like what you've done, and it's very informative and useful. But I have this comment. I get phone calls all the time from people that want to take surveys, and characteristically, I turn them down. You have 3% of your sample of 800 indicated that they had familiarity with the Constitutional Convention. I would love to have seen you take those 24 people and interrogate them in detail. Or alternatively, I would love to see you, rather doing a telephone survey, find out among a given large sample about 200 to 400 people who are informed on the issue, call them to a conference like this, have a presentation about a constitutional convention so that they can understand what the difficulties are of it, what the possible outcomes would be, and then ask them the questions. I think that would be even more informative. There's nothing to take away from what you've done.
Sure.
I think it's excellent. All right, thank you.
Well, I think that gathering of 200 to 400 informed people is probably here today. So that is obviously an important step. But I do think you raise a good point, which is in the 15 or 20 minutes that we can spend with people on the phone, there's no way that we can get into all the complexities that a convention would entail, nor can we let people ask us questions and answer them and really have a discussion. And I think if this idea moves forward, a next step in research would be to have a more qualitative discussion with voters, gather together a smaller group for a longer period of time, and have some back and forth and see how they react to some of the different ways a convention could be assembled.
Okay, yes, over here.
Thank you. My name is Hayward Robinson. I'm the mayor of Menlo Park, California. Related question to the previous one from over here about some of the more difficult issues that were raised earlier by the Lieutenant Governor, for example, the two-thirds proposal of eliminating the two-thirds proposal or a unicameral legislature. Did you ask those specific questions? And I guess I say I like seeing what people really like, but I also want to know where we're going to have challenges.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, it's a good question. There is a long list of other potential reforms that could potentially be explored. And for a lot of these issues, like a constitutional convention itself, it's not things that the average voter, when you catch them at dinner on some Thursday night, has spent much time thinking about. Even something like the two-thirds budget threshold that's obviously been in the news a lot more lately. So I think those kinds of specifics are things that also will need further investigation as additional research continues.
But did you ask that question?
We had, I can't recall whether we asked specifically about that one on our list of reforms, but we certainly didn't go into it in any detail.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Marcine Van Dierendonk, and I'm with the Dean Democratic Club of Silicon Valley. And I was just wondering if you asked about eliminating the 51% majority that can cause a constitutional amendment and making it two-thirds in a proposition.
No, we didn't ask about that in the survey.
Okay, these are all things.
Why not?
I can't remember if that came up in our discussions, but we will duly note it, and as further research moves forward, that's something we could take a look at.
That was the first question my son asked.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, over here.
I'm Alex Menon, and I was wondering, with this level of support, whether it would be feasible and or desirable to get the proposition on the to authorize the convention on the ballot for the May 19th special election.
Technically, I don't think that's possible. You know, the question of whether a lower turnout election or a higher turnout election would likely be more favorable for a constitutional convention, our data is somewhat inconclusive on that. I think it would depend on exactly what type of ballot measure was being presented to voters, how it was worded. Those are things that definitely down the line, if some effort were to be made to present this to voters, would be important to explore. But I think May 19th is too early for that to happen.
Okay, I think we've got time for about 4 more questions, so the gentleman in the hat will be the last person, but let's go over on this side first.
My name is Blair Bobiar. I work with the New America Foundation. Is there any data, questions about how the selection of participants would work? For example, random